The bullies had no idea that Jamal was a martial arts champion. What would you do if those who tormented you suddenly realized you were much stronger than they ever imagined? Jamal Carter was always quiet, humble, and kept his head down. To the bullies at Westwood High School, he was the perfect target, just a skinny black boy who never fought back, an easy subject for their cruel jokes. Every day, they laughed at him, shoved him to the ground, and humiliated him, believing he couldn't do anything to fight back. But they didn't know Jamal had a secret that would make them silent and trembling in fear. Jamal Carter slowly walked through the crowded hallways of Westwood High, holding his book tightly to his chest as if it were a shield protecting him from the outside world. He always kept his head down, avoiding the gaze of those who might cause trouble. Here, as a black student in a predominantly white school, he knew he was always being noticed, but not in a positive way. Every day going to school felt like walking into a battlefield. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't matter. To Bradley Miller, one of the most powerful students at school, Jamal was just the perfect target. Bradley wasn't just an ordinary bully. He was the son of a wealthy family, a star student who always believed he had the right to stand above others. With his fluffy blonde hair and smug smile, Bradley always had a group of friends trailing behind him, ready to laugh along with whatever joke he made. And for a long time, Jamal had become their favorite target. "Hey, Jamal, where are you off to, looking so busy?" Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Probably hiding out in the library like a nerd," one of his friends yelled, causing the crowd around them to burst into laughter. "Are you sure you know how to read? I thought you guys were only good at running around," came Bradley's sharp taunt, a racist jab. Jamal paused for a second but kept walking, trying not to react. He had become used to these kinds of insults. If he responded, it would only give them more reason to keep tormenting him. Bradley didn't stop with words. Sometimes they'd shove Jamal into the lockers, throw his books on the floor, or even steal his lunch right in front of everyone. No one intervened. Some students were afraid of Bradley, others simply didn't care. Jamal knew that if he fought back, things could get worse, but he couldn't run forever, and he knew one day everything would change. Jamal couldn't remember the last time he went to school without feeling anxious. Every morning as he walked through the school gates, he was always on edge, trying to predict what new torment Bradley and his friends would come up with. But no matter how mentally prepared he was, the humiliation always came in ways he couldn't anticipate. Bradley wasn't just a typical bully. He was manipulative, skilled at twisting everything to work in his favor. He never directly attacked right away. Instead, he created an atmosphere where Jamal was constantly put down, always seen as inferior, and everyone around him silently accepted that. They didn't just push Jamal around or steal his lunch. They wanted him to feel that his existence in this school was a mistake. They wanted him to feel isolated, to believe that no one was on his side, that he was alone and powerless against them. Jamal clearly remembered a time in the library when he was sitting quietly reading, trying to forget the mocking stares. Suddenly, Bradley and two of his lackeys appeared, strolling over with smirks on their faces. One of them grabbed the book from his hands, pulled out a red marker, and scribbled a racial slur on the cover page. "Let me decorate this for you. You don't really look like you should be holding a book like this. It's like a fish trying to climb a tree," Bradley mocked, his friends laughing along. Jamal clenched his fists, but said nothing, just lowered his head and picked up the book. He had learned that resisting only gave them more reasons to continue tormenting him. But the silence didn't stop them. It only made them think he would never stand up for himself. In the cafeteria, when Jamal was waiting in line to buy lunch, one of Bradley's lackeys snatched the tray from his hands and dumped it on the floor, spilling food everywhere. The whole room erupted in laughter. As Jamal bent down to pick it up, Bradley stepped over and placed his foot on the bread, pressing down and grinding it like it was nothing. "Look, I just taught you a lesson in economics. Here, your stuff isn't worth anything," Bradley sneered. Jamal didn't look up, didn't say a word, just quietly stood up and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving Bradley and his gang's laughter trailing behind him. But the worst part wasn't their abuse. The worst part was the silence from everyone around him. The other students, some felt pity, some felt uncomfortable, but no one dared speak up. Even the teachers who were supposed to protect him either ignored it or pretended not to see. Some even seemed to side with Bradley, as if they too believed Jamal shouldn't make such a big deal about it, that it was just harmless teasing. Jamal had gotten used to it. He knew if he fought back, things would only get worse. If he reported it, Bradley would deny it, people would believe him, and Jamal would be labeled as sensitive, unable to take a joke, or a troublemaker. So, he stayed silent. He endured. He told himself that as long as he didn't respond, it would eventually pass. But deep down, Jamal knew that one day he wouldn't be able to stay silent anymore. One day, he wouldn't want to endure it anymore. And when that day came, no one would be able to stop him. Jamal rode his bike down the quiet street, the sunset casting a long shadow of him on the road. He wasn't in a hurry to go home, because to him, home wasn't really the place where he felt safest. After a long day of enduring Bradley's contemptuous looks and harsh words, he needed a place to breathe. A place where no one saw him as inferior. A place where he didn't have to pretend everything was fine. He cycled past bustling streets, passing brightly lit shops and crowded cafes, then turned into a narrow alley where an old wooden sign swayed gently in the evening breeze, reading Kobayashi Martial Arts Academy. To outsiders, this dojo was just a forgotten corner of the city, but to Jamal, it was the only place where he could truly be himself. He pushed open the door and took a deep breath. The smell of sweat, old wood, and the familiar mat brought him instant peace. In the quiet space, the sound of soft canvas shoes scraping the floor could be heard as other students practiced, focused on each movement. In the center of the room, Sensei Kobayashi, a Japanese man with a solid build and sharp eyes, stood observing, his hands clasped behind his back. When he saw Jamal enter, he said nothing, just nodded. A small but respectful gesture. Jamal bowed in return and walked to the corner of the room, where he always warmed up before training. But before he could start, the deep voice of Sensei Kobayashi echoed, "Is something wrong today?" Jamal paused for a moment, then shook his head, pretending nothing was wrong. He was too used to hiding what he felt, but Sensei Kobayashi was not easily fooled. He walked over, his seasoned eyes seeing through everything Jamal was trying to conceal. "Jamal, you can hide your feelings from the world, but you cannot hide them from yourself." Jamal clenched his fists, feeling his chest surge with something he couldn't put into words. He didn't want to speak out. He didn't want to admit that every day at school was a psychological battle that he always lost. Sensei Kobayashi placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice slow but firm. "People can take your honor, but no one can take the strength inside of you." Those words made Jamal shiver. He had heard them many times before, but today they held a different meaning. Because he knew that every day Bradley and his friends were trying to take away the strength inside him. They didn't just want him to feel weak, they wanted him to believe that he truly had no strength at all. Jamal clenched his fists, but this time it wasn't out of anger. It was because he didn't want to let them win. Jamal had been practicing martial arts since he was young, back when his father was still alive. Martial arts wasn't just a skill for self-defense. It was part of who he was, a legacy his father had passed down. His father used to say that martial arts wasn't for fighting, but for controlling oneself. And Jamal had always believed in that. He had never used martial arts to fight, even when Bradley and his friends bullied him, even when they humiliated him in front of the whole school. He didn't want to use his strength to become like them. But today, for the first time, he started to wonder, was his patience really the right thing to do? As he stepped onto the training floor and began performing the first moves, a quick kick, a solid punch, a sharp defensive maneuver, he felt like he was rediscovering a part of himself that he had lost. A strong part, a part that couldn't be broken. Jamal didn't know what would happen in the days ahead, but one thing he was certain of, things couldn't continue like this forever. And when the time came, he would be ready. The training session ended, and Jamal walked out of the dojo, feeling a bit tired but also relieved after hours of disciplined practice. He gently pulled the hoodie over his head, a habit he had when he didn't want anyone to notice him. But as he wheeled his bike out of the narrow alley, a familiar voice rang out with a tone full of contempt. "How ridiculous! A black kid learning martial arts. Who gave you the idea you could be stronger than us?" Jamal froze immediately. His heart raced as he realized Bradley was standing just a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest, a mocking smile on his face. Behind him, his loyal followers, Ryan and Kyle, chimed in, their eyes lighting up as if they'd just discovered a secret they could use to torment him further. Jamal stayed still, but he knew he couldn't show weakness. If he showed even a hint of fear, Bradley would never leave him alone. He tightened his backpack strap, took a deep breath, and quietly started to push his bike forward. But Bradley wasn't going to let him go that easily. "Hey, I'm talking to you, rat." He stepped forward, blocking Jamal's way. "You think learning martial arts will change anything? You think you'll beat me?" He scoffed, his eyes gleaming with disdain. "Or are you dreaming of becoming like those fighters you watch on TV? Listen, kid, you can learn whatever you want, but you'll never be on our level. Never." Jamal felt a surge of anger rise inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let Bradley control his emotions, and that was exactly what he wanted. He turned his head to walk away, but just as he passed by, Bradley suddenly slapped him hard on the back, forcing him to stop. "Watch out, Jamal. You know, sometimes accidents happen. Someone might accidentally ruin your dojo. Who knows?" he whispered, his voice smooth but laced with a hidden threat. Jamal stood still, his body tense. He wasn't just mocking him anymore. He was targeting his dojo, the one place where Jamal truly felt safe. Jamal knew that Bradley and his group weren't just making empty threats. If they really wanted to cause trouble, they could make things much worse. A memory suddenly flooded his mind. A night many years ago, when Jamal was still a child, standing in the dojo with his father, listening to him talk about the tough training days. His father had said, "You may lose many things in life, but you must never let anyone take away your fighting spirit." But right now, Jamal's fighting spirit was being tested more than ever. He clenched his fist, but instead of confronting Bradley, he simply stared at him, unwavering, unafraid. Then he walked away without saying a word, leaving Bradley and his friends standing there, still laughing mockingly as if they had won. From that day on, things only got worse. If Bradley had merely insulted him before, now he was deliberately taking things further. His group started drawing racist symbols on Jamal's locker, leaving papers with offensive words on his desk. One time in gym class, Ryan pretended to accidentally shove Jamal to the floor, then laughed loudly with his friends. "Whoa, look at that. Our little fighter just fell on the ground. Guess you haven't learned that move yet, huh, Jamal?" Everyone around them laughed, but Jamal just gritted his teeth, quietly standing up without saying anything. At lunch, when he placed his tray on the table, Bradley walked by and knocked the tray to the floor as if it were an accident. "Oh, I'm so clumsy. Hope you don't mind picking that up?" He shrugged, smiling casually. Jamal didn't reply, just bent down to pick up the food scattered on the floor, ignoring the crowd's mocking laughter. But inside, his anger was growing like a storm. But the worst part hadn't happened yet. One late afternoon, when Jamal arrived at the dojo as usual, he saw something that made his heart stop. The outside wall of the dojo was covered with racist words and crude, offensive drawings. He froze, a cold shiver running down his spine. Master Kobayashi was kneeling on the floor, holding a cloth, calmly wiping away the stains on the wall, but his eyes remained as calm as ever. When he saw Jamal, he simply looked at him and said softly, "We'll clean this up, Jamal." The worst things never stay for long. But Jamal couldn't be as calm as him. He knew exactly who had done this. He knew Bradley was trying to provoke him, trying to destroy the one place he truly cherished. Jamal gritted his teeth, clenched his fists. For the first time in his life, he felt that his patience was breaking down. If they wanted a reaction, maybe this time they would get something they didn't expect. Everything felt like an endless loop. The bullying became bolder, the insults more venomous. But Jamal remained silent, holding it in, constantly reminding himself that martial arts were not for revenge, but for self-control. But everyone has a limit, and tonight that limit was broken. Jamal left the library after the sun had set behind the tall buildings, leaving the sky in a deep purple hue. He didn't realize he was being followed. As he stepped into the parking lot behind the school, a shadow darted out from the side, blocking his way. Bradley. He stood there, hands in his pockets, the dim streetlights reflecting off his face, highlighting his smug half-smile. Behind him, Ryan and Kyle, two loyal henchmen, stood with arms crossed, their eyes filled with defiance. Jamal immediately understood what was happening. They weren't here just to talk. "You thought I didn't know, huh?" Bradley slowly stepped forward, his voice dragging on as if savoring the moment. "You think I don't know what you're doing, Jamal? You're trying to change something? You think just because you know a few moves you can fight us off?" Jamal didn't respond, standing still with his hands clenched around the straps of his backpack. He was too familiar with Bradley's tactics. He never attacked immediately. He wanted to break you with words first, before finishing you off with fists. "Looks like you still haven't learned your lesson, so let me teach you again." Before Jamal could react, Kyle lunged at him from behind. Jamal felt a sharp tug on his shoulder, then a cold streak of paint swiped across his back. Jamal jerked back, but it was too late. When he turned around, his white shirt was smeared with a red racist symbol, scrawled with malicious intent. Bradley's laugh echoed, blending with the cold wind in the empty parking lot. "You look more like one of them now," Ryan laughed loudly, slapping Kyle on the back as if he had just done something great. Jamal stood motionless, his mind blank for a moment. But soon, the rage he had suppressed for years erupted like a storm. But they weren't finished. Bradley, still wearing that sneering grin, took another step forward. He bent down, snatched the book from Jamal's hands, and threw it to the ground. Clunk! Jamal froze. It wasn't just a book. It was his father's old notebook, where he had written down martial arts lessons and philosophies he always wanted Jamal to remember. And now, it lay on the ground, the cover crushed under Bradley's boot. "You don't belong here." His voice dropped lower, colder, more venomous than ever. This is not your world." The world around Jamal seemed to stand still. All the images in his mind, the childhood days with his father, the training at the dojo, the times he had endured under Bradley's taunts, everything faded away, leaving only a fiery rage burning in his chest. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt he couldn't take it anymore. For the first time in his life, he wanted to fight back. He clenched his fists, his breath quickening, his legs instinctively shifting into a fighting stance. Ryan and Kyle began to sense something was wrong. They paused and exchanged glances, but Bradley still didn't realize. He was still relishing his victorious moment until Jamal slowly lifted his head, and his gaze made all three of them freeze. No more fear, no more weakness, only the deadly silence of a storm before it sweeps everything in its path. The atmosphere in the parking lot grew dense, so heavy that even the wind seemed to come to a standstill. Jamal stood there, fists clenched so tightly they turned white, each breath slow and deep, as if he were trying to hold back an impending tsunami about to break loose. His gaze fixed on Bradley, no longer filled with fear, no longer submissive, no longer the shy boy who had bowed his head and endured for all these years. Bradley furrowed his brows, seemingly surprised by the sudden change in Jamal, but he couldn't let his subordinate see him falter. He took a step forward provocatively, like a wolf closing in on its prey. "Look who's found some courage," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can take us on just because you know a few stupid moves? Let me teach you one last lesson." He grabbed Jamal by the collar. But this time, things didn't go the way Bradley had expected. Jamal reacted immediately. A quick, precise movement, nearly invisible in the darkness. He grabbed Bradley's wrist, spun around, and used the arm lock technique that Master Kobayashi had taught him to break free from Bradley's grip. In just 1 second, Jamal was free, stepping back with his feet firmly planted on the ground, his posture ready. The entire parking lot fell silent. Bradley hesitated, his eyes flashing with momentary confusion. He hadn't expected Jamal to move that quickly, nor had he expected him to break free from his hold with such a simple maneuver. Ryan and Kyle chuckled, but it wasn't the usual carefree laughter. It was awkward, uncertain. "What the hell?" Kyle muttered, his gaze on Jamal, bewildered. Bradley, furious at his own confusion, gritted his teeth and charged forward again, this time with all the brutality he could muster. But what he didn't know was that the boy he had once seen as a weak victim was no longer there. Jamal no longer avoided, no longer ran away. As Bradley lunged, Jamal shifted his foot slightly to the side, turning in the direction of Bradley's movement, using his opponent's own force to unbalance him. Thud! Bradley stumbled, losing his footing, almost falling flat on his face. Jamal hadn't thrown a single punch. He had simply used defensive techniques, but it was enough to silence Bradley's group. Ryan and Kyle began to realize that this was no longer just a game. Jamal stood there, calm, his stance solid, like a true fighter. Bradley was fuming. He had never been so humiliated in front of his followers. "You think you're so tough?" he growled, his eyes flashing with hatred. This time, he didn't charge recklessly. He gritted his teeth, clenched his fists, and genuinely prepared for a strong punch. Jamal saw it all. He didn't need to read Bradley's mind to know what he would do next. He had seen that stance hundreds of times in the dojo. Bradley would aim for his face, trying to end it with a straight punch, using brute strength instead of technique. But Jamal wasn't afraid. He was ready. He struck. Jamal dodged to the side, fast as lightning. Bradley couldn't react in time. His arm swiped through the air, missing entirely. Jamal seized the opportunity, using a simple yet effective sweeping leg move to unbalance Bradley. Thud. Bradley fell to the ground. Ryan and Kyle were stunned. Both stood frozen, not daring to move. Bradley was completely dazed. He looked up at Jamal, his eyes filled with disbelief, but there was something he didn't want to admit. Fear. For the first time in his life, Bradley realized he had made a huge mistake. Jamal was no longer the shy boy he once was. Jamal bent down, picked up his old notebook from his father, brushed the dust off the cover, then looked directly at Bradley, his gaze sharp but devoid of hatred. "I don't want to fight, but I'm not scared of you anymore." Jamal turned and walked away, leaving behind a defeated Bradley, filled with fear, experiencing for the first time the feeling of being the weak one. The parking lot was engulfed in silence, a suffocating quiet so heavy that even the smallest sounds, the wind rustling through the leaves, the crunch of footsteps on the pavement, the ragged breaths of those who had just failed, became unnervingly clear. Gone were the mocking laughs, the derogatory words, the arrogant self-satisfaction of those who always considered themselves the strong ones. Only the stifling atmosphere of shock remained, as three people who once ruled the school now lay sprawled on the ground, completely defeated by someone they had once thought would always bow to them. Bradley, who had always been at the top of the food chain in his small world, who had never tasted failure, now lay crumpled on the cold pavement, his filthy hands pushing down into the ground in a futile attempt to rise. The pain wasn't just from the fall, but from the humiliation igniting inside him, a humiliation like never before, as for the first time, he felt weak, small, in front of someone he had always despised. He clenched himself, trying to regain some shred of dignity, but when he looked up, there was no longer the arrogance of a winner in his gaze, only confusion, mixed with something he refused to admit, fear. Jamal stood there, unmoving, no punches thrown, no threats made, simply controlling every movement, every breath, every glance, as if the entire fight hadn't even touched him. He didn't need to appear strong, didn't need to show off his power or throw insults like Bradley had done for years, because in that very moment, he had won in a way Bradley could never understand. Ryan, who had always followed Bradley like a loyal hound, stood frozen, his eyes flickering with unease as he witnessed a scene he never could have anticipated. He had just watched the person he always considered the weakest in school take down the whole group without using any violence, just through terrifying calmness and flawless technique. Every move Jamal made, every step, every counterattack was so fast it seemed like he had practiced it thousands of times for this moment. And that made Ryan shiver. Kyle, another of Bradley's lackeys, stood a few feet away, his hands clenched together, his body stiff as if he were battling with himself, deciding whether to charge in or not. But when his eyes met Jamal's, who stood there, unfazed, calm, not a trace of panic or hatred, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to charge, wanted to try again, wanted to prove that everything that had just happened was a mistake, but another part of him, a part he didn't want to admit, knew he couldn't change anything. Bradley gasped, his hands trembling as they pushed against the ground, trying to get up, but his knees shook from the fall. He stared at Jamal, his mouth open as if to say something but unable to form words. For a moment his eyes betrayed anger, hatred, and frustration, as he realized he couldn't do anything against the boy he had once considered weak. But deep inside, beneath the mask of wounded pride, was fear creeping into his mind, a fear he had never experienced before. Jamal didn't say a word, didn't need to. He simply bent down, picked up his father's old notebook, dusted off the cover, then casually slung his backpack over his shoulder as if everything that had just happened was a trivial matter not worth worrying about. He didn't need to retaliate, didn't need to prove anything, because he had come to a simple truth. Bradley no longer had any power over him. When Jamal turned and walked away, no one dared to stop him. No one dared to say a word. Even Bradley, his pride shattered, couldn't bring himself to speak. And then he left, leaving behind a heavy silence, one that Bradley and his crew had never known. A silence that was no longer a sign of fear, but a sign of a new era, one where Jamal was no longer the victim, but the one in control. The next morning, as Jamal walked into school, he immediately sensed something was off. Eyes were on him, whispers filled the air behind him, and there were sneaky glances mixed with curiosity, astonishment, and even doubt. No one said anything directly to him, but he didn't need them to. He knew that news of the confrontation last night had spread through the school like wildfire. The hallways, hidden corners, the cafeteria tables, groups of friends huddling together. Everyone was talking about something no one could have imagined before. Jamal Carter, the boy everyone thought was weak, had beaten Bradley Miller. But what made Jamal uncomfortable was how the story was being told. He had known Bradley wouldn't take defeat easily, but he never expected him to twist the truth so blatantly. From what he overheard in the whispers around him, the story had been completely distorted. According to Bradley's version, Jamal had ambushed him and his friends in the parking lot, attacking them without reason, using dirty tricks to take him down when he wasn't prepared. In his version, Jamal wasn't the one attacked, but the attacker. I didn't expect him to be so aggressive. I was just walking by, and he came at me like a wild animal. Bradley pretended to tell a group of students in the hallway, his voice full of hurt but also barely concealing his bitterness. He ambushed us. I didn't even have a chance to react. You know, I'm not one for fighting, but he didn't give me a choice. See, my arm still hurts. He raised his arm, though there were no visible wounds, but it made a few people around him nod sympathetically. Bradley wasn't just telling a story. He was trying to make himself the victim, to make everyone believe Jamal was the aggressor, a dangerous student, someone who couldn't control his anger. Jamal heard all of this, but he didn't speak. He just walked down the narrow hallways, feeling the eyes following him, sensing how the atmosphere around him had shifted. He could see the hesitation on the faces of other students. Some seemed to support him, but many were still skeptical. Because no matter how much they hated Bradley, they had never seen Jamal actually stand up for himself before. He had always been the quiet one, the one who endured, the one who never responded. So, what if Jamal did attack first? What if everything Bradley said was true? And that's exactly what Bradley wanted. He couldn't change the fact that he had lost, but he could turn his defeat into a victory in terms of reputation. If he couldn't beat Jamal with his fists, he would beat him with lies, manipulating people's thoughts, sowing doubt in those who didn't fully understand what had really happened. And that made Jamal more anxious than anything else. He wasn't afraid of Bradley. He wasn't afraid of the lies, but he feared the silence of those who knew the truth but didn't dare speak up. The entire day passed with an underlying tension that everyone could feel. When Jamal walked into the cafeteria at lunch, he could clearly hear the murmurs as he passed by. Students who had never paid attention to him before now looked at him with a strange, cautious curiosity. But what troubled Jamal the most wasn't the gossip from strangers. It was the looks from those he thought were friends. Trey, one of the few black students in the school, who Jamal used to chat with occasionally in class, just glanced at him for a moment before turning away, as though he didn't want to be involved. Lena, a girl who had always been kind to him, seemed like she wanted to approach him, but when she saw others watching, she hesitated and quietly turned away. Jamal couldn't blame them. Everyone had something they wanted to protect. He sat down at an empty table, quietly opening his lunchbox, but he knew no one was really going to leave him alone. On the other side of the cafeteria, Bradley was still telling his version of events, pulling more people to his side, continuing to control the narrative in the way he wanted. And then, just as Jamal had predicted, things didn't stop there. At the end of the school day, when he was about to leave, a message from the principal's office popped up on his phone. "Jamal Carter, please report to the principal's office immediately." Jamal stared at the screen, his palms starting to sweat. He didn't need to guess what was waiting for him. Bradley had gone one step further. He didn't just want to manipulate the story in the eyes of the students. He wanted to make it the truth in the eyes of the school. Jamal stood in front of the principal's office, his hands tightly gripping the straps of his backpack while his mind was blank. He knew exactly what awaited him inside. This wasn't the first time he had to face injustice, but perhaps this was the first time he felt completely alone. He took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, like a trial that had already been decided. Principal Parker, a middle-aged man with graying hair and metal-rimmed glasses, was sitting behind his desk, his face stern as if he had already made a decision in his mind. Next to him was the school counselor, Mrs. Bennett, whom Jamal had once hoped would be fair, but from the look in her eyes, he could tell she had already been swayed by Bradley's story before he even had a chance to speak. As for Bradley, he sat firmly in the chair across from the principal's desk, one arm crossed over his chest, the other holding a bandage on his arm as if he had just endured a heavy beating. He played the victim perfectly, his expression full of hurt, as if he were the true victim in this entire story. "I'm very disappointed, Jamal." Principal Parker's voice was low, his gaze filled with reproach. "I didn't think you were the troublemaker type, but what I've heard is something I can't ignore." Jamal remained silent, knowing that anything he said at this moment could be twisted. He had to wait, to listen to how they would try to paint a false story about him. "He ambushed us in the parking lot, sir." Bradley spoke up, his voice trembling slightly but not from fear. Rather, it was because he was using every bit of fake emotion to make the story sound more believable. I don't know why Jamal acted like that. Maybe I accidentally made him angry before, but I never thought he would attack me like that. I had no choice but to defend myself, but I couldn't fight back. He paused for a moment, then lowered his head as if recalling his terrifying moment. "I just hope Jamal understands that violence is never the solution." A long silence followed. Jamal gritted his teeth, feeling the anger rising inside him. Violence is never the solution? It was he who had pushed Jamal to his limits. It was he who had threatened him, stomped on his books, and written racist slurs on his shirt, and now he dared to play the victim? Mrs. Bennett turned to Jamal, her eyes gentle but clearly filled with doubt. "Jamal, would you like to explain what happened?" Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but just then the principal's office door suddenly swung open. Everyone turned to look. Sarah walked in, Sarah Dawson, one of the white students in the class, who had always kept silent about everything, who had never intervened in Bradley's bullying, who had never said a word when Jamal was humiliated in the schoolyard. But today she spoke up. She stood tall, her gaze steady as she looked directly at the principal, without hesitation, without fear. "I'm sorry for interrupting, but I need to say this." Her voice was calm but firm. "I saw everything." The room suddenly became as silent as a tomb. Principal Parker frowned, clasping his hands together. Everything? What do you mean? Sarah took a deep breath and then turned to look directly at Bradley without fear. I saw everything that happened in the parking lot last night. It was Bradley and his group who blocked Jamal's path. They provoked him, pushed him to his limit, and they attacked first. She paused for a moment, then continued, her voice firm. Jamal was only defending himself. He didn't attack anyone. All he did was protect himself. A wave of shock swept through the room. Bradley suddenly turned pale. He spun around, his eyes flashing with panic for a brief moment before he tried to regain his composure. "She's lying. She wasn't there," he snapped. But something in his reaction revealed his panic. Sarah didn't back down. "You can check the surveillance cameras in the parking lot." Bradley fell silent. All eyes in the room were now on him. Principal Parker, who had maintained a stern demeanor from the beginning, was now staring at Bradley with a thoughtful look. Mrs. Bennet also looked at him, but this time there was no trust in her eyes like before. A long silence followed. Bradley bit his lip, trying to find a way to turn things around, but he knew it was no longer in his control. Finally, Principal Parker sighed. "Jamal, you can go." Jamal looked up, his eyes full of surprise. "But I said you can go." The principal's voice was still stern, but no longer filled with the accusation it had earlier. Jamal nodded faintly, slinging his backpack over his shoulder and walking out of the room, his heart filled with mixed emotions. He didn't know how to feel, happy that he was finally exonerated, or confused because he never expected anyone to stand up for him. But one thing he was sure of. For the first time in his life, he was no longer alone. When Jamal walked out of the principal's office, he felt the air around him had changed, even if just a little. The oppressive feeling was gone. No longer did he feel as if he were being judged by invisible eyes. For the first time in many years, he walked without feeling like an outcast in his own school. But the biggest change was not in him. It was in Bradley. From the moment Sarah exposed his lies, Bradley lost the invisible power he once held. No more admiring looks from his followers. No more loud laughter when he mocked someone. No more self-satisfied chatter when he strutted through the halls as if he owned the place. Now, every time he passed by, eyes averted, voices silenced. Those who once laughed with him now remained quiet, too afraid to meet his gaze. He was no longer the strongest. Ryan and Kyle, two who had once been absolutely loyal to him, now began to keep their distance. They no longer sat with him at the cafeteria, no longer surrounded him during breaks, no longer followed his arrogant words as they once did. They said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They were scared, not because of Jamal, but because Bradley had shown he was not invincible. And when a ruler loses their crown, those who followed will quickly turn away. No one wants to be associated with a failure. Bradley, though always exuding confidence, could no longer hide the change in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. The self-satisfaction had disappeared. Now, he walked through the hallways as if trying to avoid the very looks he once craved. But what stung him the most was not the avoidance of others, but the change happening right before his eyes. The students who once feared him, who had always stayed silent around him, were now starting to hold their heads a little higher, especially the students of color. Jamal wasn't the only one who had been bullied. He wasn't the only one who had been seen as weak, but he was the first to stand up and take back control. And that sparked something in the other students. He noticed it in the way Trey, who had always been silent in every conversation, now looked at him with unmasked admiration. He saw it in the way Malik, the younger boy who used to be shoved into lockers every week, no longer avoided eye contact. He saw it in the way some other students of color began to gather together. began sharing their stories, and began to feel like they were no longer alone in this school. Then, something Jamal had never imagined happened. People started coming to him. At first, it was just distant looks, quiet nods as a sign of respect. But then, one day, while he was getting his books from his locker, Trey walked up, scratched his head awkwardly, but his eyes were filled with determination. "Hey, Jamal, can I ask you something?" Jamal looked at him and nodded slightly. "Can you teach me how to defend myself?" That question awakened something in Jamal. Not long after, other students started coming to him as well. Those who had been victims of Bradley and his gang. Those who had once felt powerless, like Jamal had. "I don't want to fight. I just want to know how to make them leave me alone. Do you think I can learn? I've never been strong." "I'm tired of running away, Jamal." Each person had their own story, but they all had one thing in common. They wanted to learn how to defend themselves, to know how not to bow their heads before people like Bradley anymore. And Jamal, though he never thought he'd become a leader, began to realize he couldn't turn his back on them. That afternoon, when he entered the dojo, he stood before Master Kobayashi, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Master, if I want to teach others how to defend themselves, would that be wrong?" Master Kobayashi didn't respond immediately. He simply observed him quietly, as if considering every thought Jamal had. After a while, he slowly nodded. "A true warrior doesn't just learn to protect themselves, but to protect those around them." "But I don't want to start another fight," Jamal said, his voice filled with concern. Master Kobayashi smiled, a gentle but profound smile. "Then, teach them how to fight without fighting." Jamal wasn't sure he could do it, but he knew he had to try. Because if he could help someone escape the fear he had once felt, then everything he had endured would not have been in vain. In the days that followed, the changes at school occurred in ways that no one, including Jamal, could have predicted. The students who once feared Bradley began to find their confidence. Those who used to avoid bullies no longer kept their heads down, and the former victims started learning how to stand up for themselves. But amid all these changes, there was one person who couldn't accept what was happening: Bradley Miller. He not only lost his power, but also lost the most important thing: the fear he had once instilled in others. Every time he walked down the hallway, he no longer saw the fearful, avoiding gazes. Instead, he saw nods from students to Jamal, and respectful looks they gave to someone they had once ignored. Seeing Jamal not only surpass him, but also become a figure others admired, was something Bradley could not bear. And so, he had only one choice: to provoke Jamal one last time. That afternoon, as Jamal was walking down the hallway to gym class, Bradley appeared, blocking the way. His eyes darkened with repressed anger. The hallway gradually grew silent. The students around stopped in their tracks, watching the scene unfold. They knew Bradley couldn't just let go that easily. He stared at Jamal, his face tense, but no longer with the smugness or contempt it once had. This time, his eyes held bitterness, helplessness at seeing the person he had once deemed inferior now surpass him in ways he couldn't control. "Think you're so great." His voice was harsh, but without the confidence he used to have. Jamal didn't change his expression, showing no fear or anger. He simply stood there, calm, looking Bradley straight in the eye without avoiding him. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "I just don't fear you anymore." That statement hit Bradley harder than any punch ever could. He stood frozen, not saying anything, not reacting immediately. His whole life, he had been used to having power, controlling others through fear. walking into a room knowing he was the strongest there. But right now, standing before Jamal, he realized that the only thing that had made him strong all these years wasn't himself, but the fear of those around him. And when that fear disappeared, he had nothing left. The students around him were looking at him in a way they never had before. No longer in awe, no longer with admiration, no one standing by his side. Jamal didn't need to hit him, didn't need to humiliate him in front of everyone, didn't need to use any action. He had won in a way that Bradley couldn't fight against, by taking away the only weapon he had ever had. Bradley clenched his fists as if he was about to explode with anger, but then he let go. He had no reason to fight anymore, no reason to continue, and so he turned around and walked away. Jamal stood there, watching him for a moment, with no sense of triumph or arrogance, only peace, because he knew that the real battle had never been about the physical. It had always been about controlling his own fear, and now Jamal had done what he once thought was impossible. He had regained control of his own life. Jamal walked into the dojo on a late afternoon, the weak sunlight streaming through the window, casting faint streaks of light across the old tatami mat. The air in the dojo always gave him a sense of calm, a peace that no other place could offer. But today he felt a heavy weight in his chest, something he couldn't easily shake off, even though he had won in a way he had never imagined. In the middle of the training floor, Master Kobayashi was carefully rewrapping a roll of hand tape, his movements slow and focused. Upon sensing Jamal's presence, he didn't immediately turn around but gently spoke, as though he had already sensed Jamal's mood before he entered. "Is something wrong?" His voice was calm, not rushed, but not distant either. Jamal slowly set down his backpack, walked up to the master and bowed as usual. But this time, instead of starting to practice, he stood still, his hands interlaced, eyes cast downward. "You did it," he said, his voice lacking any pride, just a simple recounting. Master Kobayashi lifted his gaze, his wise eyes observing Jamal for a moment before carefully placing the roll of tape beside him. "Tell me about it." Jamal took a deep breath and slowly recounted everything, from the confrontation in the parking lot to how Bradley manipulated the story, to how Jamal was cleared of all charges, and finally, the moment when Bradley walked away, realizing he no longer had control over anyone. Master Kobayashi didn't interrupt, didn't offer any immediate opinion. He simply listened patiently to every detail, as though he had already seen it all unfold. When Jamal finished, he waited for the master to give a comment, a judgment, or a lesson like usual, but the master just smiled. "What makes you strong isn't martial arts. It's knowing when to fight and when to walk away." Jamal blinked, surprised by such a simple answer. But didn't martial arts help me get through all of it? Master Kobayashi gently shook his head. "Martial arts is just a tool. It's not what makes you strong, it's how you use it." Jamal felt those words echo in his mind in a way he had never considered before. For so long, he had believed that it was the skills he had honed in the dojo that changed everything. But upon reflection, he realized that what truly changed wasn't the moves or techniques he had used, but how he saw himself. "The real battle was never between you and Bradley," the master continued, his gaze thoughtful. "It was between you and your own fear." Jamal's heart tightened. Indeed, it was fear that had held him back all this time. Not Bradley's punches, not his cruel words, but the belief that he didn't have the strength to change anything. Bradley didn't need to hit him to win. He only needed to make Jamal believe he couldn't be defeated. But when Jamal stood up, when he was no longer afraid, Bradley lost the only power he had ever had. "So, did I really win?" Jamal asked, his voice soft, yet carrying a sense of relief he had never felt before. Master Kobayashi nodded gently, but there was something deeper in his eyes. "Victory is not the end, Jamal. It's just a new beginning." Jamal pondered this as he walked out of the dojo that evening. The weight on his shoulders was gone. He hadn't just defeated Bradley. He had defeated himself, the person he once was, the one who always bowed his head, always stayed silent, always believed he had no choice but to endure. And now, he knew he would never return to that person again. When Jamal left the dojo that night, he felt a change that no one could deny. Not only within himself, but also in the world around him. The following days at Westwood High School unfolded with a different atmosphere. There were no longer the disdainful glances as Jamal walked down the hallway, no more mocking whispers whenever he sat alone in the cafeteria, no more public bullying that everyone had once pretended not to see. Instead, something new was slowly spreading. At first, it was just silent nods from students Jamal had never spoken to before, looks full of acknowledgement, eyes that no longer saw him as invisible. Then it became whispers. Students who had once been victims of Bradley and his gang now started to hold their heads a little higher. They no longer avoided him furtively in the hallways, no longer hurriedly picked up their food that had been spilled on the floor without saying a word. And then, something truly important happened. One morning, as Jamal was getting books from his locker, he heard a familiar voice at the end of the hallway. "Move!" It was Malik's voice, the younger boy who had always been an easy target for bullies. Jamal turned around and saw a scene that, just weeks ago, seemed impossible. Malik was standing face to face with Ryan, Bradley's old lackey, who had just deliberately bumped into him. But instead of silently lowering his head like before, Malik stood his ground, eyes locked forward, no longer afraid. Ryan said nothing, just gave him a glance, then walked away. Could he have beaten Malik? Possibly, but he knew the world had changed, and Jamal realized that. He hadn't just regained his own respect. He had sparked something bigger. Change didn't come immediately, nor did it happen dramatically, but it began to creep into every corner of the school, into every group of students, into how people treated each other. Black students who had once felt excluded now had the confidence to speak up. Students who had been bullied, those who had once lowered their heads and accepted their fate, now understood that they no longer had to be afraid. And even the racial discrimination in the school slowly began to shift. Before, racist remarks were often made casually, and racist jokes were always seen as harmless. But now, when someone said those words, someone stood up. Because Jamal had done it first. And that made people like Bradley, the ones who thought the world would always belong to them, begin to feel less safe than before. Bradley was no longer the center of every conversation. No one stood by him anymore. Those who had once idolized him now began to avoid him, not out of fear, but because they realized he had no power anymore. He couldn't rule through fear if no one was afraid of him, and that was something he could never reverse. Jamal had never thought he would become an icon. He had never wanted to be a hero, never wanted to be the center of attention. He just wanted one simple thing, to be left in peace. But when he walked through the hallways and saw the students who had once been victims now standing up for themselves, he realized that sometimes fighting for yourself can change more than just your own life. It can change the world around you. And though he never sought fame or recognition, people began to see him differently. They no longer saw a shy, timid boy who always lowered his head and endured. They saw a warrior. That evening, Jamal left the dojo after a long training session. The tension in his heart was gone, the weight of pressure lifted, leaving only a gentle peace he had never experienced before. He stepped outside, standing in front of the dojo, taking a deep breath to let the cool evening air fill his chest. The night sky stretched above him, stars sparkling in the silent void as if listening to his thoughts. Jamal looked up, his eyes shining with reflection. A light breeze passed by, carrying memories. Those days when he was bullied, the times he silently endured, the moments when he thought there was no way out. But then he changed. He didn't defeat Bradley with his fists, didn't take him down with aggression or revenge. He won with his own steadiness by refusing to be afraid, refusing to be controlled by the terror Bradley had used to dominate him for years. And in that way, he changed everything. Jamal clasped his hands together in front of his chest, as if honoring what he had overcome, the journey he had walked, the person he had become. He whispered softly, his voice blending with the wind. "Father, I've learned to fight not with my fists, but with my heart." He didn't expect an answer, but there was something in the stillness of the air that made him feel as though his father was listening. He knew that no matter how the world might change, no matter what challenges he would face in the future, he would never go back to the person he once was. He would keep moving forward. Not to prove himself, but because he knew that true strength didn't come from beating someone. It came from controlling himself. Jamal's story ended, but the message he left would never fade. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to fear and still move forward. True strength isn't in muscles or technique, but in the heart and resolve of a person. And in a world where people like Bradley always exist, where injustice can appear in many forms, one thing remains true. Those who dare to stand up not only change themselves, but also change the people around them. Jamal learned an important lesson. The real strength doesn't lie in fists, but in how we control ourselves, how we face our fears, and how we don't let them define who we are. He didn't just stand up for himself, but also inspired others to do the same. Sometimes a courageous act can create a wave of change that we never expected. What about you? Have you ever faced injustice, been underestimated, or felt like you didn't have the power to change something? What did you do to overcome it? Share your story in the comments below, because who knows, your story might inspire someone just like Jamal. If you found this story meaningful, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching, and always remember, the true strength comes from within you.